So the four questions for tonight: why can't I see God? Why can't we see God? How can we reconcile God with science? Why is Judaism so obsessed with idolatry? Is God jealous? And the last question, well, I'm a spiritual person. Why do I need to follow the Torah's system in order to have a relationship with God? Great question. Okay. Let's start with the first one. Why can't we see God? Well, you know the old saying?
Because we are Shema.
Oh, Shema. The reason why we can't see God is because we have to listen. We're Shema. Okay, we'll come to that. So the old saying is seeing is believing. If God wants us to believe in him, wouldn't the simplest way be for him to make himself visible to us? I mean, let's just say you want to see God. Now the question is, so what does he look like? What would you imagine you're going to see? An old man sitting on a throne? So on a basic level, the reason why we can't see God is because he doesn't have a body. And he's not physical. And therefore he's not three-dimensional. And you can't reproduce him on a 3D printer. And this is how Maimonides articulates this idea in his listing of the primary principles of the Jewish faith. Text number 1 on page 173. The third principle of the various principles of faith is the negation of God possessing corporeality. We believe that the one God of whom we speak is neither a body nor a bodily faculty. All activity that transpires with a body, such as motion or rest or lodging, does not relate to him, neither in his essence nor in his doings. And the fact of the matter is that there are many things that the human eye can't see. So anything which is not physical or anything which is not three-dimensional. So we can't see, for example, smells. We can't see sounds. We can't see anger. We can't see a mathematical theory in the physical sense. So the idea of seeing God at the most basic level is kind of nonsensical because there's nothing for the physical eye to see, because we can't sense him with the physical senses. Now, Dr. Irving Bloch was a professor of philosophy. He was a man who I knew very well, and he became an observant Jew, and he writes a lovely text in the following, text number 2 on page 174, in which he writes as follows. There are some philosophers, such as N.R. Hansen, who argue that as a matter of fact, there is at present no such evidence for God, but there might be at some point in the future. What would such evidence look like? And Hansen describes it for us. Quote, the heavens open, the clouds pull apart, revealing an unbelievably immense and radiant Zeus-like figure towering above us like 100 Everests. He frowns darkly as lightning plays across the features of his Michelangeloid face. He then points down at me and exclaims, for every man, woman, and child to hear, I have had quite enough of your too clever logic chopping and word watching in matters of theology. Be assured, N.R. Hansen, that I most certainly do exist. And that's the quotation. So continues Professor Bloch, the first question one has to ask is, if it is God himself, if this is God himself, this would deny the basic thesis of monotheism that God is not a finite figure that has a visible form. No one raised in this tradition of the Bible would ever suppose that a Zeus-like figure could be a manifestation of God, much less God himself. An ancient Greek might, but Hansen was not addressing himself to an audience of ancient Greeks. He was speaking to modern man, and this man, be he theist or atheist, if he looked up in the sky and saw Hansen's Zeus-like figure, would first of all be frightened out of his wits, and secondly, he might think Earth was being invaded by outer space creatures. If this figure then proclaimed that he was God, only an imbecile would believe it. Probably the last thing one would think of is that this is a manifestation of God. In other words, if you try to imagine God in any kind of childish way of some physical form, etc., we're kind of like just not there. I mean, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't stack up. None of us are going to believe this. The problem is, however, that when we ask this question about why we can't see God, we don't only mean it in the physical sense. The Webster Dictionary describes sight as to perceive with the eye, to perceive or detect as if by sight. Two definitions: to perceive with the eye literally, or to perceive or detect as if by sight. So when someone says to you, "Oh, I see," it doesn't mean that he actually sees, not a physical thing. It's got nothing to do with eyes. And if somebody were to say to you, "Have you ever seen love?" you would answer, probably, "Yes." But what did you see? You might have seen people in love. You haven't seen love, because you can't see love per se. But so that's the point about the seeing. It has a different definition. And so while it makes sense that we can't see God with our own eyes, our real question is, when we say, why can't we see God, is we're really meaning, why can't we perceive him in some other way? And then the question becomes a lot more interesting. And the thing is this, that historically, we could argue that lots of people have seen God. For example, at the crossing of the Red Sea. Look at the text number 3a on page 176, in which we learn as follows. It's taken from the Midrash. A human king arrives in a province accompanied by his inner circle, warriors riding at his side, and he is preceded and followed by legions of soldiers. Yet, because he is human like all others, everyone asks, which one is the king? However, when God was revealed at the Red Sea, there was no need for anyone to ask, which one is the king? When they saw him, they recognized him, and they all proclaimed, this, pointing with a finger, this is my God, and I will glorify him. So there is a sense at which an entire nation saw a revelation, not physically, of course, but they saw something. So there is a historic sense of seeing. And a little bit later on, of course, we have the story at the foot of Mount Sinai, where again we have this concept of seeing, the nation seeing, the whole nation. It's on page 177, text number 3b. God said to Moses, "Tell the children of Israel, you have seen that I spoke with you from the heavens," from the Bible. You have seen that I spoke with you from the heavens. And then, of course, a little bit later on, you have prophecy, and a form of seeing was very common during the period of the prophets. And the Torah is filled with stories of prophets seeing and speaking with God. And the fact that God doesn't have any physical form or image didn't prevent him from allowing individuals or even an entire nation from seeing him. So once we have moved past defining seeing as being with the naked eye, and we also understand it as the idea of perception, our discussion has taken on an entirely different form. And we see this expressed beautifully in text number 4 on page 178. Moses and the other prophets apprehended God with what scripture refers to as actual vision. For example, in Exodus chapter 33, "You shall see my back," says God to Moses. And Isaiah says, "And I saw God." And in Genesis, God appeared to Abraham. Now, clearly, the expression of seeing is meant as in a metaphorical sense, and it does not refer to literal sight by the physical eye. Nevertheless, the analog needs to resemble the analogy. prophetic vision must be in a form of grasping the essence of a certain spiritual reality in the same way as sight enables us to see the essence of a physical thing. And therefore, Onkelos, who translated the Bible into Aramaic, translates Abraham's encounter, which we mentioned above, as God became revealed to him, meaning that God, who is hidden, became manifest and revealed to Abraham. So therefore, we do have a lot of historical evidence of people seeing God in this broader, more subtle context of perception or revelation. And the problem is this: nowadays, most people don't see God anymore, or certainly not in the way in which you've described it. And why? Actually, we need to rephrase the question a little bit. Instead of asking why we can't see God, we should be asking the question, why do we need to see God? Why do we need to see God? Anyone? What's going to happen if you could see God?
Probably cost you faith a bit.
Oh, so the answer around the table over here is it's probably going to help your faith a bit.
Yeah.
Yes, we agree. Yes.
It's going to humanize God, whereas you can't humanize God.
That's a very perceptive comment over there. That's lovely. Thank you. It's going to humanize God. Yeah. Well, you see, let's pick up the answers which were given around the table over here, because people would think that if I could only see God, it's going to be much easier for me to believe in him. And as a consequence, then to follow his instructions. Yeah? And it would prove to me as well that he exists. So I'd be much more likely to do the things he's asking if I had slightly more evidence that he was actually there. Yeah. So seeing him would be seemingly tremendously beneficial in terms of our faith and our belief in him. So it tests our faith more not to see him. But you see, the problem with seeing him actually is if we think that seeing him is going to lead to a greater belief in him, we have a big problem. And the problem goes back to those instances which we've already described of the occasions when the entire nation saw God at the splitting of the Red Sea and at Sinai. And what happened as a result of all of that? They saw God. It was the biggest revelation in the world. It's never happened again at that level. Every person could see God. And 40 days later, what are they doing? They're dancing around a golden calf. So it seems that seeing him didn't work.
If they saw him, why didn't they say what he looked like?
If they saw him, why didn't they say what he looked like? Because that kind of seeing is not something which you can describe in physical terms. It's a revelation. It's something which happens at some other kind of level within a person. It's not the physical level where you can say, I can describe this, because to describe something has to be either three-dimensional or a language which, if you want to describe a beautiful piece of music, you have a language to do that. We have no language to describe God. It's outside of our limitations of language. So they couldn't describe what it is. It's something which is so deep that it's beyond the capacity to put it into, to verbalize it and to put into words. Okay.
Did it, at some point, did we...
Questions coming around the table here, which I'll repeat because people can't hear it.
Could we say that we were made in his image?
We were made in his image, so yes, but that doesn't help us because the image, when we talk about his image, means that we have the characteristics that he has, not his physical image, not the physical image. Another question.
If we saw him physically, then he could become an idol.
If we saw him physically, he could become an idol. That would be humanizing, that we heard here on screen as well, indeed. So I just want to take this through over here because the historic examples that we gave show to us that seeing God doesn't increase belief or doesn't create lasting belief. And that's what we need to get to the bottom over here, because with that, we're going to find the answer to the question that we have asked. You see, it's like seeing God at Sinai, or the Red Sea, was a little bit like the sun shining in your room. It's not the room that is innately bright. It's the sun that's shining into it. And then when the sun disappears, the room becomes dark again. And this is the big principle about Judaism. Real change in human beings only happens when it is triggered from within. Change can't be imposed from the outside. If it is, it might lead to compliance, but it will never lead to transformation. For change to be authentic and to be lasting, it must come as a result of the product of our own efforts from inside of ourselves. And we see that in his next two texts, text number 5a and text number 5b on page 180 and 181. There is a profound advantage to spiritual revelation that is earned through a person's efforts. Because first of all, the enlightenment is tailored to their subjective abilities and standing. And secondly, the reward is not what is termed the bread of embarrassment. In other words, a handout. It is something which we've earned ourselves through our own efforts. And additionally, effort and toil fashion the person into a fitting container for the light. Once the person is a proper container, the revelation that they'll subsequently receive fully integrates into the person's personality because they've prepared themselves to receive the revelation. And it resonates within the person, and it becomes part of them. And in text number 5b, therefore we must serve God by our own efforts. Our service is higher when we're led by the hand from above. That's very nice when you have God coming down and revealing himself to us. That is much higher, but it is much more precious when it is generated by our own efforts. So here you have two models. One model is the idea of a revelation, God showing himself to a nation. It's big and high and enormously exciting, and it takes your breath away. It is a moment in history. It's awesome, but it's not lasting. The only thing that really lasts are the things that we actually bring from inside of ourselves. And you can go back to any big experience that you might have had in your life that was awesome and awe-inspiring, and try and recapture it. And while you can, in a sense, recapture the event in general terms, you can put yourself back in that place, and you can allow your imagination to, close your eyes. You can see yourself there, but you can't feel the emotion anymore. You get a little bit of it, but you can't get it the way it was, because it was something which came from outside, and it's gone. It's like the sun that came into your room, and it's gone, and the room is dark again. And the revelation that comes into the body, into the human being, is momentary, transitory, very powerful, but not lasting.
So does that mean we can't handle revelation?
Well, you ask a very good question, and I'll just hold that one for a moment. Okay. So that is the reason why God generally does not allow himself to be seen. Because as useful as it might be, it would not be lasting. And if that's the case, therefore, we need to ask Simon's question a few moments ago. If that's the case, if revelation is not such a great thing after all, then why did God ever reveal himself? At Sinai, for example.
So if there's been so few,
Question coming around the table here.
there's been so few occasions of revelation.
Yes.
Surely what we need to do is interpret and perceive our own happenings in our life.
Yes.
That feel
Okay.
like
So, and you're saying that if there have been so few revelations of this big nature over here, and that then we have to actually work within ourselves to actually touch some revelations in our own lives, but it needs to come from inside of us through our own work. Is that what you're saying, Andy?
to perceive things
To
in our lifetime that have occurred.
So we need to perceive things in our own lifetime, in our own lifetimes that were, in a sense, revelations. And yes, have we not all had personal revelations? What parent has not had a revelation of God in the moment for the very first time where they held their first newborn child? Wasn't that awesome? And other moments in our lives as well. So the answer, let's come back to the question now. So why did God ever have this big revelation if it was so transitory? And the answer is because there had to be initially a moment in which God broke down the barrier between himself and man. And that happened at Mount Sinai. That opened the door for us and all the generations that followed to be able to seek him of our own initiative and to find moments of personal revelation. Had there not been that initial revelation, the distance between God and man would never have been breached, would never been connected. So that kind of like broke open the channel or the pipeline of connectedness between the divine and the human. That's what Sinai did. And after that was left to us. And of course, there were great prophets of immense stature who did have levels of revelation. And there are people of lesser stature who have smaller revelations. But it always has to come through our own efforts. We don't ever expect any longer that there's going to be a kind of big show out over there, what do you call it, light and, what do you call it, pardon? So, yeah, sans lumière, exactly, thank you very much, yeah. So here's the thing, that over the centuries, we've actually never stopped seeking him, even if very frustratingly, we might never get to the point where we actually see him. Certainly not in the way in which the prophets did. Until eventually, we might reach the apex of humanity as prophesied by Isaiah. I'll read it for you, but it's text number 6 on page 181, in which Isaiah says that the glory of God will be revealed, and together all of humanity will see that the mouth of God has spoken. That is the ultimate aim of humanity from a Jewish point of view. So the answer to our first question then is, our question was, why can't we see God? And the answer is, God can't be seen because he wants us to find him. And perhaps, as always in life, the process of searching is more rewarding than finding. Look back on occasions when you have had to search for a very long time to find something, and eventually you found it. And the searching was the exciting part, wasn't it? It's almost flat when you've got it. Almost flat. That's our first question tonight. Can we reconcile God with science? So there is a perceived divide between science and religion. And the question asked by many seeking minds is, can we reconcile science with God? There's a lovely story over here about one day, the zookeeper noticed that the gorilla was reading 2 books, the Bible and Darwin's Origin of the Species. So the zookeeper is a bit surprised, and he asks the ape, he says, why are you reading those books? Well, says the gorilla, I just wanted to know if I am my brother's keeper or my keeper's brother. So now, there are actually 2 questions packed into this one question here. The first is, do we need God? And the reason why we ask that question is because years ago, when very little was known about the origin or the system or the function of the universe, the answer to all of the world's mysteries was God. Yeah. But now that science has peeled back the layers and we understand so much more about the universe, now the question is, do we still need God? That's the first part of this question. And the second part of this question about religion and science is, where is the evidence? Because the scientifically minded person only accepts that which can be empirically proven. Belief, by definition, is not evidence-based, and therefore it is unscientific. So can a person believe in God, or for that matter, can a scientific person, a scientist, believe in anything? Does belief come into their world? Because belief can't ever be proven. So regarding the first question, do we need God? I think the fact is that even if we discovered and understood everything about the universe, we would still need God. Supposing the entire universe was open to us, we had cracked the DNA of the universe. And the argument is, even then we would need God. And the reason? Because science and God are not in conflict. Because they are on two completely separate tracks. They're doing different things. Science explores the universe. God is beyond the universe. Science explains what it is, and God explains why it is. And Jonathan Sacks, as always, put it magnificently in text number 7 on page 182. There is absolutely nothing in science, not in cosmology or evolutionary biology or neuroscience, to suggest that the universe is bereft of meaning, nor could there be, since the search for meaning has nothing to do with science and everything to do with religion. Imagine what it would take to explain to someone who had no conception of money what is involved in withdrawing cash from a dispensing machine. He might watch the process 1,000 times, understand precisely the physical properties of the credit card and the dispensing machine, but still have no idea about what has taken place. Explaining the transaction might include a history of the division of labor, of exchange, of barter, the origins of precious metals as currency, the shift from real to nominal value represented by a banknote, what a bank is, what deposits, withdrawals, and credit are, and so forth. There is an internal logic of the system. It's called the laws of banking. But the meaning of the system lies elsewhere, and it can only be understood through some sense of wider human context in which it is set. The internal workings of a system do not explain the place that system holds in human lives. The meaning of the system lies outside the system. And therefore, the meaning of the universe lies outside the universe. And the same is true for science, whose subject is the interrelationship of things within the natural world. Nature is sublimely indifferent to who we are and what we deserve. There is nothing moral about it. It carries no meaning within it. Science tells us how the parts are related. It cannot tell us what the totality means. So the scientist needs God, even if the smallest percent of the universe that science does not, even in the small percent of the universe that science does understand, because science only explains the physical phenomena that are observable and measurable by our instruments. And God provides moral values and meaning and purpose that science on its own can't provide because it's not its thing.
Because it's not.
It's not its thing.
Yeah.
That's not what science does. And that therefore leads to our second question. What is the evidence for God's existence? And again, for a scientifically minded person, the only way to be certain that something exists is if it can be verified or falsified. And if not, it either doesn't exist, or at best, it's irrelevant. I remember meeting a very famous British scientist called Hans Eysenck, who was considered to be the father of modern psychology. He was the head of the Department of Psychology at the Institute of Psychiatry, which is attached to the Maudsley Hospital. And I was in business with his successor, Professor Geoffrey Gray, who was after Hans Eysenck, who was the second most cited psychologist in the world, as it happens. And Hans Eysenck was the first. And I met Hans Eysenck shortly before he died at a conference. And he said to me, if it's not measurable, it doesn't exist. And that's a pure scientist. He needed to be able to measure everything. That he was talking about, forgive me, those of you who are into dynamics and psychoanalysis, but this was the empirical side of psychology, not the lie down on the couch and tell me about your mom's side of psychology. So because that was not measurable, they had no time for it. He only wanted things which were absolutely measurable. At any rate, you see, a scientist needs to know if something is measurable. You see, theoretical science predicted the existence of the Higgs boson, which was known, by the way, as the God particle. And its existence wasn't confirmed until it was observed in 2012 in the Large Hadron Collider. But the point about it is that even though they couldn't first identify it when they theoretically predicted it, it was something which ultimately could be found and measured, and therefore, yes, it's scientifically valid. It's there. Can you ever say the same thing about God? Can you ever say there will come a time in which we'll be able to empirically prove that God exists? Now, I've studied philosophy, and I studied the philosophy of the rationalists, Spinoza and Descartes and all the others, and they gave wonderful rational explanations for the existence of God, and by the time they're finished, it left you absolutely cold. It meant nothing. It was just word games, thoughts, nothing that's going to change your life. It didn't impact one iota on belief because it wasn't empirical proof. It's all theoretical. So if the scientist needs to have this empirical knowledge, can the scientist therefore ever be a believer? And by the way, there's no shortage of atheist scientists, of whom one of the most famous in this country, of course, is Richard Dawkins, who is the self-avowed atheist, and who wrote, "Science is based upon verifiable evidence. Religious faith not only lacks evidence, its independence from evidence is its pride and joy, shouted from the rooftops." That's why he couldn't believe in God. But for those who do choose to believe in God, belief in God doesn't make you either a bad scientist or a weak rationalist. But the lack of evidence is not problematic because God and science are on different tracks. One belongs to the world of belief, and the other one belongs to the world of empirical evidence, physical evidence. One is about morals, and the other is about how things fit together in the universe, how they connect. It gives us no sense of why we are here, what our purpose is, why we were created, how we should behave now that we are created. Science tells us nothing about that. You can watch the fascinating, wonderful programs of Richard Attenborough, of which I'm a great fan, and look with amazement at the wonders of creation and the extraordinary things that animals do and the behaviors, etc. But you can show them, and you can even explain, sort of, because this helps them to survive, but you can never find the ultimate reason why did God create this creature? That's not a question that science can ask. There's a lovely statement from Dr. Frances Collins. She was the one who oversaw the International Genome Project. And this is what she wrote in text number 8 on page 184. In my view, there's no conflict in being a rigorous scientist and a person who believes in a God who takes a personal interest in each one of us. Science's domain is to explore nature. God's domain is in the spiritual world, a realm not possible to explore with the tools and language of science. It must be examined with the heart, the mind, and the soul. And the mind must find a way to embrace both realms. The God of the Bible is also the God of the genome. He can be worshipped in the cathedral or in the laboratory. His creation is majestic, awesome, intricate, and beautiful, and it cannot be at war with itself. Only we humans can start such battles, and only we can end them. Isn't that a wonderful quotation? Yeah. So putting it a little bit differently, science is the study of the laws of nature, but God created those very laws. And therefore, does it make sense to subject him to those same laws? So for many, like Dr. Collins, their faith and their belief is in fact enhanced by science. Because when we observe the awesome beauty and the precision and the magnitude of the creation, our relationship with the Creator is enhanced. Rabbi Kook was the first chief rabbi of Israel. He was a very profoundly spiritual man, a very deep thinker. And this was prior to this formation of the State of Israel when he was the chief rabbi. And in text number 9 on page 185, this is how he put it. With the recognition of existence comes an enduring recognition of and reverence for God. The persistence of natural law tells of the wisdom and greatness of the Creator. In the words of the prophet, lift up your eyes and see who created all of this, says Isaiah. And therefore it is fitting for every wise-hearted person to draw, lovely expression over here, to draw waters of reverence from the precious spring of existence. Waters of reverence, to draw waters of reverence from the precious spring of existence, for it all expresses honor to its creator. And the other thing, of course, is this, that the more the scientist discovers of the mysteries of the universe, the hard truth that emerges is that there's really so much more that he or she still does not understand. And one scientist put it very humorously in text number 10 on page 186, with which we conclude this particular topic. And he says as follows. This is Robert Jastrow, God and the Astronomers. At this moment, it seems as though science will never be able to raise the curtain on the mystery of creation. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries.
Right.
Isn't that lovely?
Yeah.
Okay. So our answer to the question then, God does not need to be reconciled with science. Science and religion are not incompatible. They're just two different tracks. Okay. Why is Judaism so obsessed with idolatry? Is God jealous? Is our third topic for tonight. Pardon? Open a Bible and you will find scores of admonitions against idolatry. I mean, read the book of Deuteronomy, Moses' last words to the Jewish nation. in the last days of his life. It goes on and on and on. Is man completely obsessed with idolatry? There's so many commandments which are associated with this practice. Of the 613 commandments, a huge number of them relate to idolatry. And in fact, nothing says this more than the fact that in all history, God directly communicated to us collectively as a nation only once at Mount Sinai. And what were the first two things he said? I am your God, and make sure you don't have any others. Okay. Idolatry right in over there. So in fact, the avoidance of idolatry is so central within Judaism that it's actually in our name. The word Jew is actually from the Hebrew Yehudi, Jew. That's Yehud, Jew is Yehud, sort of transliterated into an English translation. And the Talmud says that the name Yehudi means someone who repudiates idol worship. Yeah, that's what the word Yehudi means as far as the Talmud is concerned. Okay. So we are repudiators of idol worship in our essence. Are we unique? We were at the time, and may even be at this time, other than the Muslim religion, possibly. So why the centrality? Okay, it's very nice and important to believe in one God and to denounce all the others, but what is so significant about there being one God? I mean, let's be slightly heretical for the moment, yes? I mean, would it really matter if there were just a few more? Huh? Doesn't seem to affect the Hindus all that badly. Yeah, okay. And if God is such a good idea, then a few more of them actually might have some benefit in the world. Yeah? So, but actually our real question over here is, how is this even relevant today? Because back in the day, pagan religions and idolatry were all the rage. Okay, we understand that at the time that the Bible was given. And some Eastern religions still do quite well with this. But who these days is really tempted to bow down to a statue or to the sun or to a figurine? It's just not us in the Western world. So does that therefore mean that the large portion of the Torah is irrelevant and outdated? That's what lies behind this question here tonight. So in fact, even in our times, there is good reason for these repeated warnings, because the term idolatry, just like the term seeing, has to be extended into another dimension. It's a subtle word. It should not be taken in its most literal sense. Look at this following teaching from Maimonides. I'll read it to you, it's very short. It's text number 11, page 187. The early sages taught, getting angry is tantamount to idolatry. Go and figure that one out. Why is anger tantamount to idolatry? And the answer is because if I truly believed that God runs this world, I wouldn't have any reason to get angry. Whether I'm missing a train, tripping on a banana peel, or anything worse, God forbid, if I believe that God runs the world and runs all the events in my life, this was decreed to have happened. And it wasn't random. It was supposed to happen. So what am I getting angry about?
The big ask.
It's a big ask, of course. The only reason why I would get upset is if I were to think at some level that this wasn't supposed to happen. And in that very thought, there is emphatic and explicit denial of God and his control over the world. Do you get that? Okay. So let's take the argument a step further. Let's make it a bit more dramatic. Someone is standing and throwing stones at you and cursing you. And there's still not a good reason to get angry. Okay, this person has made a choice to be hurtful. That's his or her business, and they will have to account for it. But it has nothing to do with me. The fact is, if this event occurred to me, that person has his own calculation with God, and I have my calculation with God. And if this event happened to me, it must mean that this God intended it to happen to me. So if I'm angry at the other person, what I'm really saying is, I'm denying that ultimately it is God who is in control and who caused this. So I'm taking away the power from God, and I'm putting it in the hands of my tormentor. In Jewish terms, that's what we call making an idol. It's very subtle. This is the way Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi put it, text number 12b on page 188. Our sages equate anger to idolatry. The reason for this is clear to those who have understanding, because at the time of anger, a person's faith in God departs. For if one believed that what happened to them was God's doing, they would not be angry at all. Granted, a person with free will cursed or struck or caused damage to the property of the victim, and for their evil choice, they are liable for punishment in the court of law as well as in the heavenly court. Nevertheless, heaven has already decreed that the incident befall the person who was harmed, and God has many agents through whom he can act, and happen to act through this particular agent who harmed you. And that is why the prohibition against idolatry is so central in Judaism and remains so even in our times, because it has nothing to do with God being jealous or of stone statues or anything silly like that. In fact, it cuts to the very core of Judaism. Do I believe in God and in his total dominion and control over the world? And at any time that a Jew places his trust or lends power to anything other than God, this is effectively called idol worship in our religion. And so therefore, a person has to ask themselves this question: what is your higher power in this world? Is it money? Is it your own self-image? Is it the power of another human being over you to make you happy or to make you miserable? Say a parent or a spouse. And all of these are subtle forms of idolatry, and they're completely incompatible with our Jewish belief system. Okay. So that's the answer to our third question. Why is Judaism obsessed with idolatry? Because we believe in only one God and only in one power, and nothing else in this universe has control or dominion over our lives. My life and everything which happens to me is in the hands of Almighty God at every moment. And as soon as I, in my thought, veer away from that, as an anger, I veered away from that total, absolute commitment to that fundamental belief about my life and my destiny. And this is very empowering, by the way. If my life is in the hands of the Almighty, no one else in this universe has power over me. Even when I'm enslaved, even when I'm tormented, they can't control my belief or my mind, only my body. That is the power of the individuality and the freedom that have been granted as human beings. And placing our trust in anything other than God's absolute control is the very essence of idolatry. That is why the Torah is obsessed. I am the Lord your God. Don't have anything else in front of you. Because if you do, you've lost your understanding of my relationship with you in this universe. Isn't that great?
Revelation.
Pardon?
That's a bit of a revelation.
That's a revelation, isn't it? Yeah. 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 And finally, for tonight, good people, I am a spiritual person. Why do I need to follow the Torah system to have a relationship with God? I hear this so many times. People say to me, I'm not religious, but I am very spiritual. I respect that. I'm not knocking it. It's a very good place to start. But the fundamental question is, so then, okay, I don't want the religion because it cramps my style. It gets in the way of my freedom. You see, for me, being able to appreciate God is when I walk on a beach and I see a beautiful sea and a sunset, and it's so inspiring, and I feel so close to God. And, you know, when I sit in shul and I listen to the Sedra being read, I don't understand a word. It's been going on for, seems like for hours, and I'm bored out of my mind and I can't relate to it. So where am I going to find my religion? In the house of worship, which doesn't speak to me, or in the places that does speak to me? I'm spiritual. I will do things which touch my spirituality. That's why I love yoga, because it puts me in a good space, mentally and emotionally. And frankly, all the rituals of Judaism just don't speak to me. Yeah? We've not only have we all heard it, we've actually all believed it for ourselves sometimes as well. Okay, and that is the last question with which we have to deal here tonight. And it is absolutely almost a universal question amongst so many Jews, because we remain a spiritual people, but not necessarily a religious one.
But is that the one that comes from the other?
Does the one come from the other one? Well, the fact that there's so many spiritual people who are not religious in terms of taking on a kind of religious set of rules and observances, it doesn't. And by the way, today we just had in this country, for those of you like my sister in America, we just discovered today that Christianity, the last census showed that there are more people in this country now who do not believe than who do believe, and Christianity is it is no longer the case that a majority of people living in this country are Christians or believe in Christianity. Okay, but the fact that this person would say, I'm not a Christian, I bet you that if you spoke to them, they might very well say, but I am spiritual. They might say, I don't believe in God. And even if they said, I don't believe in God, they might still say, I'm spiritual. So we need to get to the bottom of this. Because if the crux of Judaism is about connecting and having a relationship with God, why do we need a religious system, this overlay, in order to do it? So to answer this question, we have to go back to our founding father, Abraham. And this is what we learn about Abraham. We're going to start with text number 13a on page 190. After this mighty person, this is taken from Maimonides. After this mighty personage, Abraham was weaned, he began to ponder deeply. Though he was a young child, he began to contemplate by day and by night. He had no teacher, nor was there anyone to inform him. Rather, he was mired in Ur-Kasdim population of foolish idolaters. His father, mother, and all the people around him worshipped idols. He would worship along with them, but his heart was busy analyzing everything, and he gained a clear understanding. Ultimately, he arrived at the true way and understood the path of righteousness through his accurate comprehension. He realized that there was one God, that he created everything, and that there was no other God among all that exists. So, energized by his new understanding, Abraham then decides to take on the entire generation of idol worshippers. And he wants to convince everyone that there's only one true God. So the story now continues in text number 13b on page 191. Abraham used his recognition and knowledge of the Creator to formulate presentations for the population of Ur-Kasdim and to debate them, informing them that they were not following the true path. When he won them over with the strength of his arguments, the king desired to execute him. His life was spared through a miracle, and he relocated to Haran. He then began a public campaign, loudly proclaiming to all humanity and informing them that in all the universe there is but one God, and that it is appropriate to worship him alone. He traveled to publicize his message everywhere, rallying people in city after city, kingdom after kingdom. When the people would rally to him, questioning him regarding his statements, he would explain to each individual according to their understanding until he had brought that individual back to the true path. Eventually, tens of thousands rallied around Abraham, and they are the folk referred in the Torah as the people of the house of Abraham in Genesis chapter 17, verse 23, and in whose hearts he firmly planted this great fundamental principle. Wow, what a story. Here is an individual who unilaterally discovered God and then single-handedly took on all the accepted beliefs of all civilization. Had Time magazine been around at the time of Abraham, he would have been named Man of the Century. But let me tell you what is extraordinary. None of this appears in the Bible. Everything that we have read is in the Midrashim, in the Talmud, and not in the Bible itself. The Torah gives us nothing of this backstory. In the Torah, we are introduced to Abraham at the age of 75, when all of this has already been achieved. And all we're told about him at first is something about his lineage, that he is a 10th generation from Noah, and that he married a woman called Sarai at that stage before she became Sarah. And then the Torah continues, and we see on page 193 in text 14a, how the Torah chooses to begin with Abraham's life. 14a. God said to Abram, he's not Avraham yet, he's still Abraham, Lech lecha me'artzecha mi'molatecha me'beit avicha el ha'aretz asher ar'eka. Go forth from your land and from your birthplace and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. So what happened to the entire backstory? The backstory of one of the most remarkable feats in the whole of history, one of the greatest demonstrations of a person's devotion to God. The first 7.5 decades of Abraham's life set the tone, not only for the rest of his life, but for all of progeny towards the end of time. We are walking in his footsteps. And all of this is omitted from the Torah. Instead, what we get is a travelogue, kind of matter-of-fact story of God instructing Abraham to begin a series of travels. What a puzzle. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe explains the significance of this glaring omission in text 14b on page 193. The Torah emphasizes at the very beginning of the Jewish story in the narrative of Abraham what makes a Jew unique. Abraham's uniqueness as a Jew and his elevated stature do not begin with his extraordinary qualities, with the closeness to God that he achieved through his own toil and efforts, but rather with what God said to Abraham. Go forth. It begins with God setting Abraham apart. Abraham's relationship with and attachment to God was established through God commanding him and his fulfillment of that command. Let me unpack the significance of what the Rebbe has said over here. In the first few chapters of Abraham's life, His relationship with God resulted from his own remarkable search for meaning. And he continued to search and to study and to teach, and he continuously grew in his knowledge and his appreciation of God's wonders. And these were all the accomplishments that he achieved on his own. But the most important and defining moment of Abraham's life, the point at which the Torah begins his story, is when God flipped the relationship on its head and commanded Abraham to leave his homeland and to travel to Canaan. This is the first instruction that Abraham has received from God. And from this point onwards, he is connected to God, not by searching for him, but by serving him. And this is a 180-degree shift in the relationship. And this is the type of relationship that we're privileged to have with God. Not one that starts with our own decisions and our own epiphanies and our own spiritual enlightenments. We start with a relationship that is initiated not by us, but by God. And this is no small difference, by the way. You think about it. What can we possibly give to God? Why would God ever think of paying attention to us? For any relationship to exist, there has to be some kind of common ground between the two parties to the relationship. And the problem is that we have no common ground with God. He is the infinite, awesome, perfect creator who we described in the very first sessions as completely and totally transcendent and beyond this entire universe. And me, what am I? I'm a puny, flawed, little, here today, gone tomorrow human being. A speck of nothingness in this entire universe, here for of time and then gone. Where's the relationship? How can there be a relationship? Even if I was able to get his attention for a moment, why would he care? How do I connect with this awesome, extraordinary, beyond my comprehension being in this universe? So I can educate myself about his presence. I can become more refined. I become more spiritual. I can give meaning to my life, and I can give a sense of purpose to it. I can do whatever I want and be as spiritual as I want and feel as spiritual as I possibly want. And I can feel really close to him, but it doesn't mean to say that I have a relationship with him, because it's just what I feel. Because no matter how high we climb, it's like piling trillions of zeros on top of one another to get to the number one, and that doesn't work. Because the finite can't connect with the infinite. We, as human beings, have no way of creating a relationship with God, but God can choose to make a relationship with us. We can't reach out over the divide, but he can. And that is the power of a mitzvah, a commandment. A command from Almighty God to puny man. That's the way in which we connect, because that's the way he has chosen to establish a relationship with me. He's asked me to do something. And when I do it, I've connected with him in a relationship. So the Torah, you see, is not a system at all. It's a framework that contains 613 strands, each one of which is designed to strengthen our relationship with God, because each one of those is the ways in which God asks us to act in the world, what he wants of me as his creature. And so the answer to our question, why can't I just be spiritual, is because no matter how spiritual you are, it is always an expression of your own ego. I feel very spiritual. I am connecting with God. Who the heck was I in the big scheme of things? What a chutzpah. I feel so close to God. Well, I'm glad you feel close to God. That's wonderful. You feel a lot more spiritual, a lot more tuned. Yes, I feel tuned into the universe. I'm in tune with nature. God wants us to do all of that. He wants us to connect to his cosmic world. He wants us to sensitize ourselves, to become refined human beings, to be tuned in to his world, to his nature, to his existence. And he wants us to climb high and high and refine ourselves more and more and more, but it never creates a relationship because we can't create a relationship with God.
Well, are you saying that when you're doing it, you're only doing it to try and strengthen? You said we don't have a relationship.
When you do that mitzvah, when you fulfill a command, you know, the analogy is sometimes given in Hasidic thought. Imagine you have a supremely great scientist who is on some kind of hugely elevated, incredible intellect, and, you know, really at the highest level. And there is a very simple janitor, you know, somebody sweeps the floors. They've got nothing in common. They live in different worlds, socioeconomic worlds, but worlds of thought. There's nothing common. Where's the connection between these two people? When this great person says to this very simple person, would you mind please just, you know, sweeping up around over here because I've left a bit of a mess. Suddenly there's a relationship between them, even though they're on completely different levels. So that mitzvah means when I do it, I'm not doing it because I want to, I'm not doing it for myself. See, a command is not something which I wanted. It's something which God wanted. And that changes things completely. I believe that we are the only religion that is actually command-based. Lots of other religions are about searching for God and coming closer to God. But the concept of a mitzvah is absolutely unique to Judaism. As it happens, it was this very thing that was abolished by the Christians because they said, no, what's really important is the way in which you feel about God and connect with God. But well, the mitzvah, you know, that's why Christians don't keep kosher, because it's a command from God, or don't, you know, keep the strict laws of Shabbat. All of that was swept away. And for us, we realized that actually, if you take that away, you've taken away our relationship with God. Judaism says, I don't want to start with what I need, what I am looking for. I want my life to start with my recognition that I'm a creature created by the Creator, and that I'm here to do what he has asked of me as his creature, to fulfill his vision for my humanity in this world, not what my own dream was. Because my dream is a vain dream, however high it is and however beautiful it is. It's just a human dream. It's not a divine dream. So, over the past 6 weeks, we have explored 25 of the most often asked questions about God. And the question with which we have to end tonight is, what have we taken from this great endeavor? And if we leave this course with only our intellectual curiosities somewhat satisfied, in a sense, it would have missed the point of it all. And I'll tell you why with a story. So there was once an aspiring rabbinical student who arrived in the city of Kotsk in Poland and asked to be accepted as a student of the great Hasidic master, Reb Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, very famous Hasidic rabbi who is known for his total pursuit of truth. And when he interviewed the young man, he said to him, there are many yeshivot in Poland, what is it that brings you here specifically? So the young man replied, I seek God. For that you come here to find God? Says the Rebbe incredulously. If that's the case, go back home. God is everywhere. He's in your hometown just as much as he is here. So Rebbe, says the young man very hesitantly, if God is everywhere, why do people come here to study under you? Those who come here, the Rebbe explained, come here to find themselves. And that would be the very best outcome of this course, if it's helped us to find a little bit more. We thought we were coming to find God. Actually, we came here to try and find ourselves.